Welcome to Explore, Explain. This is a long-form video and podcast series sharing conversations with data visualization designers and developers from around the world. Each episode explores the detailed hidden thinking behind a single project or a series of related works to explain the what, the why, and the how of the design process. So let's jump in to today's episode with your host, Andy Kirk.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Explore Explain. My name's Andy Kirk and welcome to all listeners and viewers of the video version of this podcast episode. And in this episode, I'm delighted to welcome Jess Carr to the show. Jess, it's lovely to meet you. Thank you ever so much for giving up your time today for the benefit of everyone out there. Can you give us a short intro, who you are, where you are, and what it is you do, please?
Sure, yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Jess. I'm currently working as a AI/ML UI UX engineer at GSK. Before that, I was getting my undergraduate degree, which I did in environmental science. And then through kind of various interests and internships, I started getting into kind of data visualization and data storytelling.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for spending your time with us today, because we're going to go through a really intriguing project that I absolutely adore. Came across, I think, just before Christmas, when I heard that you'd won the Pudding Cup for the best. I think it's the best data and visual story. I can't remember the exact wording of the award, but it was a very prestigious thing to win. You won the gold prize alongside Denise Liu, who we had on the 8th episode of last season, I think it was. But we're going to talk about your project today. So once again, for the benefit of the viewers and listeners, could you sort of just paint a picture for us about what this project is? It's titled "Since When Does Vogue Hate Text?" So just tell us a brief little bit about this project, please.
Yeah, so the project it's an analysis of the amount of text that is on the covers of Vogue magazines. It kind of discusses that sort of journey from the start of Vogue, but it focuses mostly on the last 20 years or so. I think more broadly, the project kind of examines the economical, technological, and social trends through the lens of the cover design. And the project kind of manifests itself as sort of an interactive visual data story.
Wonderful, yeah. I think it's an interesting point you make there about how it's about the text of Vogue, but it illuminates other things beyond that through the analysis and the studies that you go through. And it really is I think it really does kind of exist as a quintessential data story. We often use this term storytelling with data, and it can be a little bit overplayed and sometimes mislabeled for certain projects, but this is not. This is perfect as a label for that. And I guess the starting point always is, where does this project come from? Why did you do it? What was the situation that led you to do this project in itself? So I guess the first question is, what was the opportunity to do a data viz, full stop, at the time that you did this? Was it part of your studies? Was it just a passion project that you wanted to work on? What was the sort of situation?
Yeah, it was a personal project through and through. A lot of the work I do, like professionally, is kind of hidden, just because it's like confidential information. So it's nice to be able to make something that uses the same skills, but I can kind of share more publicly. And I also just like doing these little personal projects to learn new techniques, especially because I didn't come from like a programming background.
Right.
It's nice to be able to practice those technical skills. Yeah.
That's right. Sort of liberating from the constraints of a project that has
Yeah.
clients and customers and specific requirements, and something that, as you said, gives you this chance to sort of flex your muscles and try things out and experiment in a sense without consequence in many respects. So that's the context for why you did a project, but why did you do this project? What was the kind of motivating choice for something that ultimately is, it's a lot of work to get the data for this project. So what made you kind of choose this particular inquiry?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long story, but I tend to keep a notes file just on my computer with little fragments of thoughts that I think might be interesting to explore. And so this was an idea that kind of was created in there changed a little bit. There are definitely some inspirations that kind of culminated in this idea. I think probably the two most prominent ones were I saw this graphic by Bernard Rudofsky, I think it's pronounced, called from a book called Our Clothes Modern, and he had kind of mapped to where like pockets were on different clothing and where buttons were, and I thought the idea of mapping was really clever and just kind of very literal in terms of the data visualization. And the other piece was I was looking at the D3 contour map on Observable for work, but they had an example where they had the contour map of like newspapers and mapping where I guess like titles and stuff were. So I think those were kind of the seeds that planted into this larger project. And in terms
Absolutely.
of
Yeah, so I was going to go on to Vogue magazine itself. I mean, are you a Vogue
Yeah.
reader? Are you a magazine reader, subscriber, collector?
I definitely was more of when I was a kid, and I think that's where kind of my love and appreciation for the covers really started. When I was really young, I used to read like J14, which is kind of like a gossipy magazine for children. And then my family had the subscription to Time magazine. And I think for those especially, I used to just look forward to the covers more than actual reading them themselves. And I think kind of lifestyle and fashion magazines are not maybe perceived like seriously or positively by society, perhaps as like a victim of like gender contamination. But I think kind of magazines, the covers especially, are sort of artifacts of like social history and are definitely worthy of analysis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And in your kind of intro to the project, you talk about one particular issue, which was, I think, looking at my notes here, the May 2022 cover with Rihanna. And I think I might be right that this was Rihanna's at least second appearance on the front cover of the magazine. And you kind of talk about your almost your outrage at the brevity of the text. I think you quantify there were 5 words and 29 characters, and you describe this as appalling. Where's all the flashy text gone in its mismatched type, size, weight, and color? And you set in motion a desire to unearth the lost art of textual exuberance. What a brilliant kind of subtitle to a project there. So obviously this kind of opening kind of case study that you talk about there, the 2022 Rihanna front cover, very Spartan in its content. Was that a specific magazine cover that sort of tipped you over the edge into, right, this is the thing I want to go and do? Or was it something that you actually kind of found already through your process of discovering the patterns and thought, actually, it's a really good example to bring the audience in to kind of introduce the basis of this inquiry?
Yeah, I think it was definitely more the latter in terms of I thought it was a good example of kind of a difference.
Yeah.
But I do remember like where I was when I first saw the like May 2022 cover of Rihanna. I just being, well, first I was kind of amazed at kind of the creative vision and just the photography that came out of it. But I originally saw it without any text on it at all. It just had the Vogue masthead, and I thought that was very unusual, especially because I grew up on J14 where you can't find a spot without text on it. And so to have that kind of transformation, I thought was really interesting to explore. Yeah.
So if you've, as you've said, you've kind of grown up surrounded by magazines, and the front cover is such a ceremonial thing, and it's so important in terms of what it's conveying, in terms of the imagery and the tone, but also, and we'll speak about this a bit later on, you talk about the kind of the history of magazines and how they've almost evolved in what they have to do to sell the prospects of that particular issue, whether it's kind of covering the front with all the in this week's issue or in this month's issue, to something that's almost more of an exhibitory piece, more of an artifact that you know, Vogue is so established, it almost sells itself. You don't really need this as a contents list to decide, will I, won't I buy it? So it's an interesting story that we see through the data, but also through the narrative that you've kind of compiled around the data. Before we just move on to some of the contextual factors, were there any other things that you attempted to undertake in terms of the kind of curiosity that you ultimately pursued around the proportion of text coverage? Were there any other avenues that you almost did instead of, or in addition to, rather than that?
Yeah, I guess maybe a little bit more context. I think one of the reasons I landed just on analyzing Vogue itself was it limited the amount of data I needed to collect, and B, I think I was really fascinated by Anna Wintour herself and her influence and reign on Vogue, and how she herself has kind of like pushed it into these different directions. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought
no,
there.
not at all. But I
Yeah.
mean, I was just wondering if was there any other kind of analysis essentially about
Right.
the
Yeah.
covers? I don't know. I'm thinking, you know, you could potentially look at things like color usage or, you know, the subject matter of the photographs.
Yeah.
But was it quite clear early on that this text proportion coverage was kind of the thing you were going to sort of home in on?
Yeah. The other two things I was looking at was kind of, well, I know Anna Wintour was quite influential on like how she photographed the models on the cover. So one of the kind of earlier ideas I had was mapping like where the model's face or their eyes was on the
Right.
cover rather than the text. But I didn't know if that would have a strong narrative behind it as much as the text did. And then another idea I had once I kind of collected the data, I was more thinking about the story, was if I could analyze spatially where the text was on the page and if that had kind of shifted or changed over time.
Right.
But I thought I'd keep the narrow quite focused.
Yeah.
The focus quite narrow. So yeah, that's how I ended up on just the text coverage.
And I mean, it paid off in the end, as we'll talk about shortly, because, you know, there was a pattern, and, you know, I won't spoil that question for now. We'll come to that shortly. Some other contextual factors. You talked about it as a passion project and something that therefore clearly is about trying to stretch your experience and capabilities and practice and I guess something that is free from the constraints. But did you have any constraints self-imposed with respect to how long you were going to commit to doing this? Did you have a certain, I don't know, like allocated budget of time that you thought, I'm going to give myself 4 weeks, I'm going to work on it no more than an hour per day, and then whatever it will be at that point? Or was it something that you just thought, I'll finish it when it's finished?
Yeah, more the latter. Yeah, I think I wanted to have kind of a project that was completed last year, which is a massive timeline for myself. But I didn't. I never wanted it to feel like a chore, like I had to do it, because this is just something fun to do on the side. If I had kind of that motivation, so yeah, there was no timeline, but yeah, I was hoping to get it done by the end of the year, which I did manage to do.
Very good. And also, I mean, it's something that we'll probably finish off on in the conversation later, but I'm just wondering, did you see it, and do you still see it as a one-off piece? Or is it something that you might top up with updated data and or expand to look at other magazines, other similar kind of inquiries?
Yeah, I think when I finished it, I kind of thought like done and dusted. I'd had enough of looking at it, thinking about it. But that's been a lot of feedback I've been getting afterwards about, is this the same for other magazines?
Yeah.
Could you kind of expand the analysis to further back in Vogue's timeline? So I guess maybe never say never, but I think I'd want a more automated way of collecting the
Yeah.
data, which I think we'll get to. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And just the last thing about context as well. Obviously, you've talked there about the desire to sort of practice, and it clearly seems to be something that lends itself to a digital production. Were you ever tempted, given the nature of the topic being magazine and print, to do something for print? Not perhaps only for print, but perhaps as a spin-off output. Was that something that crossed your mind?
It actually didn't, but that's not a bad idea.
Okay.
I think I was one of the things I really wanted to practice with this project was the like scrolly telling part
Yeah,
of
yeah.
things, because I know that's such widely used and widely loved tool in data visualization, and it's not something I had ever done in like a major way. I'd only really tinkered with it before. So I really wanted to kind of leverage that in kind of presenting the
Yeah.
story. Yeah.
And you talked there about storytelling, and it is the kind of core mechanic of how one experiences this piece of work. And I noted in your commentary at the very end of the project, actually, the sort of tools that you'd used, and you mentioned Python, SvelteKit, D3, and also Scrollarmor. I was going to say Scroll Alarm, but Scrollarmor. That's one I've not come across, but I guess that's obviously the I mean the clues in the name. That's obviously the tool that helps with this scrollytelling mechanic. Was that a complete new experience and exposure to that tool then, and was that something that um, quite appealing for this project?
Yeah, I never used that library before, and the other the front end framework I was using, SvelteKit, I had never used that before either.
Right. Okay.
Um,
Wow.
yeah, but I know it's quite well loved within the data visualization community, so it seemed like a good choice, and I had a little bit of experience working with it at work. And Scrollama it's a JavaScript library, but it's I think specifically made for SvelteKit or a Svelte project. And I found some really useful resources by Connor Rothschild about how to kind of integrate SvelteKit D3 Scrollama.
Right.
So that was just kind of made it a bit more intuitive for me to
Yeah.
understand and easy to whip up. Yeah.
And obviously we've talked there about technology, but at the start of a process, we've also got the sometimes the need to do sketching and to think a little bit kind of off the screen about ideas that come into mind. In terms of a process, are you a natural sketcher and collector of colors and patterns and textures and ideas, and then kind of bring them into some sort of digital scrapbook? Is that something that you observe as a creator?
Yeah, definitely. I think definitely where I am in my like current programming journey, sometimes the ideas I have in my head are a bit more advanced or complex than what I could at the time program myself.
Right.
So sketching, I guess, helps me kind of refine the vision for the project without feeling limited by kind of my technical capabilities.
Yeah.
Um, and I do spend more of like my day job in kind of like the UI design space. So things like color choices, typefaces, those are all very important to me. So yeah, I love kind of doing a mood board and stuff.
I mean, you talked before about kind of keeping notes or a document going about ideas and curiosities, and I guess are you also someone who kind of collects just things that are nice and things that inspire, like colors and typeface that you might not use the very next day, but you've always got that kind of, I don't know, that catalog of references if you just need to unblock some creativity at some point.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to keep everything in your
Yeah,
head, and I love to just write things down or else I forget it. So if I'm ever stuck creatively, I have a Figma board, just random bits and pieces of art, pictures, anything like that, which I can go back and reference. And I mean, you never know when it's useful for a
absolutely.
project.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely not. And sometimes, collecting those things also gives you a sense of what not to do as well.
Yeah.
It's something that can be helpful in both ways, I think. The last question I had in terms of context, or at least the initial vision that you had for this work, um, was there any other work that you'd seen done, visualization work, sorry, being done on something similar that might have given you some sort of inspiration, or or even something again to not do, to say, oh, that's been done. I need to find a different approach that gives my work a chance to sort of be different, distinguish itself. Were there any things out there that you thought, yeah, I'd like to emulate or kind of do something different to what I've seen out there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think when I was initially researching for the project, I didn't want to kind of step on anybody's toes in terms of this analysis. And I did find one piece about kind of a magazine's journey with cover lines and cover text, which I used a lot to inform kind of my understanding of these trends. And I think it is linked in the project as well, but I couldn't find one that was sort of like data informed and kind of showed that quantitative analysis. And in terms of other kind of inspirations or things to copy, I mean, the pudding for me has always been like this massive inspiration. I think that was kind of the first place I saw potentially like niche or silly questions being explored through this kind of analytical lens and having a kind of a larger theme running under it. And I think that kind of ethos and even sort of the design choices that they make in terms of being sometimes like literal in terms of how the data is displayed, those are definitely kind of guiding me throughout the project.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, so there is one more question to ask about the context, and it's a crucial one. But you've talked about this being a passion project, so in a sense, there isn't a defined audience that you are having to serve. But obviously, there's a lot of writing in the project, so you've obviously thought about who's the reader of this writing, let alone the viewer of the viz. Who did you have in mind when you were writing that stuff and for the visuals? Were you thinking of Jess Carr on the other end of this, or was it just, did you just think about Vogue magazine interested people, or I won't try and fill up gaps in. I'll let you answer the question. But yeah, who were you thinking this could be for?
Yeah, I think for me it was sort of like Gen Z millennial type age, someone maybe interested in pop culture or maybe too chronically online like myself. I remember I sent it to my dad, who's in his 60s a little bit. It doesn't kind of pay attention to this kind of stuff, but yeah, he didn't quite get it, but that's okay.
It's nothing.
Yeah.
No, that's important. I mean, obviously, for something like this, it can be just as much for yourself as anyone else, and if it works for someone that you can imagine being like you, then that's probably a good sort of litmus test for whether it'll work in a sort of wider context. Right, we move on to the data then. So this is not an insignificant amount of work that you've done to get this data. I guess the first question is, how did you kind of land on the design of the data gathering methodology in a sense? Because it was quite manual, wasn't it? But there were some methods to assist you with that. But how did you kind of land on that process, and what was the process that you did arrive at?
Yeah, when I first started the project, I think Apple had just released a feature where on pictures you could like highlight the text in it and copy that. And so at first I thought I could try to use something like that, like text detection methods, which I did try that in using Python and OpenCV again, but I just wasn't having much luck with it. I think it just wasn't as consistent and as accurate as I'd like it to be.
Right.
And for a project that was the crux of its success, I really wanted that to be as accurate as possible. So I ended up kind of importing the images into like Figma, and then covering the entire cover in a white rectangle, and then covering where the text areas were with like a black rectangle. And that made it much easier to just say how many black pixels are there compared to like the entire
so make it as contrasting as possible rather than relying on the tool to do it from an image of the cover itself. Yeah, that makes sense.
Exactly, yeah. Because one of the issues I ran into was the text on the covers of the magazines, it's all different typefaces, it's all different weights, different colors. The background's really noisy, so it's hard to get the code to like pick that up. But just having kind of that black and white made it a bit simpler. And maybe if I kind of progress in my OpenCV knowledge, I could get something automated to work. But yeah, I think it was more of like it was definitely a trade-off in terms of how much time do I want to spend trying to finesse this bit of code versus can I actually save time by just doing it myself.
It's a really great point. I think that's at the heart of the tension of all attempts to automate things, and especially for things that are novel techniques, things that haven't really been done before, and also things that you might not do again. You've got to weigh up that investment of, you'd love to, of course, have a one-click sort of process and get it done. But in the absence of that, then just sometimes rolling the sleeves up and saying, right, I'm going to manually do part of this and then automate the rest of it, I think is certainly kind of a justifiable trade-off that you might end up at. So we've got data from the first issue dates back to 20. I've made a mistake in my notes. It's 2000. Is that right? January 2000.
Yeah.
Right the way through to December 2022. What was the cutoff of January 2000 that made that the first data point?
I think it was down to two things. One was just of time for Will in terms of how many magazines that I actually want to like annotate. And the other, I thought it was just a very convenient, neat number to look at kind of the last 20 or so years. So it was still a good amount of time, but to analyze it.
And I'm just wondering, looking a little bit in the rear mirror now, looking back at the project, would you have changed that at all? Would you have still gone with that January 2000, or is there a certain milestone in time? I don't know, Anna Wintour's era and timeline, but have you had any thoughts subsequent that might have said, actually, I could have started 2001 in June because that was a key point, or I should have gone back to 1997 because there was a point in time then when it made sense? Have you had that sort of reflection, or is it still something that you feel is kind of justifiable?
I mean, in an ideal world, I would have done all the magazines because then I could have tracked how each editor themselves was influencing the magazine. I think Anna Wintour started in the late 80s, so
that's a lot more work.
That would have been nice as well. Yeah. But I think it was nice. I didn't know this kind of when I was annotating at the time, but I do think it was nice that you could see sort of that rise in text coverage into kind of like the mid 2000s, and then sort of like the steady-ish decline. And kind of the 2010s, and then sort of like the steeper decline more recently. So you do kind of get like those three phases. Which it's not just a matter of like, yes, it increased, yes, it decreased, or
that's right,
decreased the whole time.
I think you're right, that sense that I can imagine if you'd been looking at the data and it was just a decline from the very start of this, you might have been tempted to kind of widen the window to say, right, when did this decline start? But the fact that you had that little bump and then the drop, I think, is quite a satisfying judgment to have made, I think, more than anything else. And obviously you've talked there about kind of refining the data gathering process. And again, looking back, do you feel that it gave you the most reasonably accurate data that you could have conceivably got within the limits of the efforts that you could have put in?
Yeah, that was definitely a big concern of mine. Sort of the annotation of the covers and kind of collecting this data was happening probably over like weeks, if not months, just because I would do a bit here, a bit there, because it's quite tedious work. So one thing I was really concerned about was kind of how I was making these rectangles. Was it accurate across like these sessions, about how like close I was getting to the pixel, should I be separating
Oh yeah,
this cover line from this cover line, or
yeah,
should it just be one big block?
yeah.
So one of the things I tried to do was I created a mini app just so I could run through each cover, make sure that this overlay of the annotations was relatively accurate and consistent across magazines. But it seemed like it worked pretty well. I'm sure there's areas where I could have improved that, but I think for the purpose of the project, it worked good enough.
Well, that's it. And I think there's an important distinction between accuracy in terms of absolute precision and accuracy in terms of consistency. If everything's always wrong by a degree of 2 to 3%, then it doesn't really matter what the absolute number is. You kind of know where things are. But for a repeatable process like this, you almost have to go through a few to then work out all these little discrepancies and all these little caveats and all these nuances that you need to make sure that you've got consistency going forward. So yeah, how you treat, the little gaps between words, is it still one block or not?
Yeah.
There isn't a right or wrong answer. It's just come to a decision and just repeat that throughout the process, I guess. And although it's not necessarily data gathering, it kind of is, but alongside the actual data gathering, you've also got to, I guess, inform yourself a little bit more about Vogue and the history of magazines and subscriptions. And as I said, there's a lot of text that comes with in terms of your story about, illuminating us about the reasons behind some of these patterns. I don't know. It's quite a broad, open question, but what kind of research work did you have to go through? Did you have to do a lot of reading? Where did you get the sources for informing you about this stuff? And I guess, did you enjoy that side of it as well?
I mean, it was super interesting. I didn't know much really about Vogue, probably pre-Anna Wintour. I hadn't seen a lot of the covers kind of from early 1900s or so, and I thought those were really beautiful as well, so they were a joy to look at. And in terms of finding out about kind of the design choices, it was very ad hoc, I'd say, in terms of what's out there. It was a lot of kind of more blog, I'd say, pieces,
Right, yeah.
rather than sort of published papers or anything
Official
like that.
histories, yeah.
Yeah. A bit came from sort of different newspapers that were reporting on the time. But yeah, most of it was kind of bits and pieces here and there. It didn't seem like a widely researched topic, unfortunately.
Now, when you get into this stage now of you're starting to, you've got the data, you've started to analyze it. Was there that moment when you first saw the chart, the little bit of analysis that you did, and you saw this pattern? Was there just a moment of delight of, yes, it was all worth it? I can see that my inquiry was worth doing. What was that like?
Yeah, it was amazing. I think because you just do this little proof of concept chart in Python or whatever, and you don't quite know what the results are going to be. I think maybe anecdotally, I could look at the magazines from 2005 and 2023 and think, okay, this one has loads more text, but to actually see that the trend was so visible, it decreased by quite a good amount. It was really exciting.
Yeah, that's. I can't think of the last time something like happened to me actually. Not often. And to be honest, it is rare that you do analysis and it has this sort of beautiful trend that backs up your hypothesis, and I think it's something to cherish when it does happen. I don't know if this is a random question, and don't worry if don't have the answer to this, but what happened in May 2004? There's a weird outlier where it's not yet triggered the trend, but May 2004 there's hardly any text. Do you know what the story was there?
Yeah, I think it's Nicole Kidman on the cover, and I actually found that cover really beautiful, and the color scheme, and that actually informed the color choices I picked for the piece.
Oh, okay.
But that cover in particular, I think she did a double feature for the Australian version of Vogue, and the Australian version has more text on it.
Right.
But the US Vogue cover they went very simple and plain. which is
Oh, wow.
I'm not sure why, but
Yeah.
yeah, that was interesting to see that kind of very obvious outlier.
Well, that's it. Because you do have
Yeah.
this relatively tight trend elsewhere, but that is something that
Mm.
it's almost like a precursor to what happens. It's almost like, oh, that looks nice. Maybe we should
Yeah.
strive towards that going forward.
Yeah. 20
Um,
years later.
exactly right. I've got there eventually. So let's get into the design, and we'll kind of gradually sort of work through the content, and there's a lot to go through, so we won't go through everything. But the first thing that we are greeted with, irrespective of whether you arrive on a desktop or a mobile, is this kind of hero image, this initial sort of cover banner. And I'm interested, it's a very almost minimalist opening. Did you feel that you needed to sort of, I don't know, either go full on with the text like the older Vogue covers, or did you need to go for something that kind of matched the more recent Vogue patterns? What's the kind of evolution of how that welcome image and title formed?
Yeah. I knew I wanted to have like a full screen, like hero landing page type thing, because it just felt like, okay, this is the cover to my
Correct, yeah.
little article magazine type thing. And I think in terms of finding out what I wanted to have on that cover, it did go through a few different designs. I think originally I thought of doing like I don't know, it's like newspaper cutouts, like
Like a
almost
ransom
like
note.
scrap.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, which maybe not the vibe I was going for. And I thought I that kind of imagery reminded me, I get too closely of like the burn book from Mean Girls, or kind of the sour imagery and visuals that Olivia Rodrigo did. And so I thought I'd tie it a little bit more closely with the visuals from Vogue. So one of the things I thought would be, I guess, funny would be have like a gradient in the background, because I know Vogue recently at least loves to do like studio shoots where they have kind of that gradient that's created by just light and shadow. And I thought I'd put Anna Wintour on there because I think she's just sort of like so
The embodiment of Vogue.
influential.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And in terms of the text on it, I did want it to be a little bit almost like tabloidy, a little bit clickbait, because
Yeah.
to kind of go back to like some of the earlier cover lines I used to use. But I thought the rest of it I just keep quite minimal, just because I didn't want to get it too busy or messy.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on the title, how many different evolutions did you go through of that title wording? Because I can imagine that you could have had so many different ways of titling or heading this project. And, did you go through lots, or did you just say, that feels like the right amount of words and the right text? And as you said, a little bit, the word hate, it kind of just gets a little bit of the tabloidiness of it.
Yeah. It went through a few iterations. One thing I really wanted was kind of the Vogue to be the most prominent thing, and to have that in kind of the or a similar typeface to what they have in their logo. And I wanted to have a kind of it to be like above and below on each side, to kind of reference to kind of how the cover lines are on usually either left or right side.
Yeah.
And so I think finding the right phrase or sentence so that it would feel the balance, but also the messaging would come across.
Yeah, and it absolutely achieves that. And then we go down the page, we scroll down, and we encounter, as we said before, this sort of Rihanna case study, this context, and I've now got a date of the original. So it's April 2011 was the first occasion. And correct me if I'm wrong, are these the two occasions that she's been on the front cover?
I think so. She's been on loads and other versions, but I think these are the US ones. Yeah.
But again, as you make clear in that kind of little intro, that there's a stark difference between those two covers, and it's a really kind of perfect way to not just set the scene for your study, but to also start to sort of give us a little bit of breadcrumbs towards the methods that you've used, and almost sort of taking us from this transition of here's a visually rich cover image, and we're going to turn that into blocks, and then we're going to turn that into a chart, and that's kind of how we're going to sort of take you from here. So again, just sort of talk me through the evolution of that step, because it feels like an important scene setting part of the content, really.
Yeah, I think you hit upon a lot of the reasons why I chose to set it up that way. One, in terms of just showing how the methodology, what the methodology was. I personally love when a data story does that, because I think oftentimes I have no clue how this data was collected,
Yeah.
and it's a bit more interesting to have it explained visually. And it gets you more interested in the data, and you understand it a bit better, I think. So that was really important, one thing to me. And in terms of, I wanted the reader to be comfortable with how I collected the data. Again, like what I was mentioning before, I was worried about, I guess, being almost like mysterious about like how I collected the data and whether it was sort of like pixel by pixel of the typography, or whether it was these larger text boxes.
Yeah.
So I wanted to be upfront about that. And I also had this vision of like the transitions between them, which I kind of mentioned like the scrolly telling piece, but I wanted to kind of practice and learn how to do these kind of chart transitions.
Yeah.
And I think that was a really nice place to kind of leverage that.
Well, it absolutely is. I think the transition, especially, obviously, there's the transition from the cover images to the revealing of the blocks, but then it's the transition from those blocks as individual parts and how they kind of form like a reforming, formerly melted Terminator. Kind of they get to the top of the kind of portrait magazine page. That's a lovely, smooth and elegant thing, and I think it's a part of design thinking that you could argue is the least important. You know, that doesn't carry content, doesn't inform somebody, but it just makes the whole thing just seem ever so more cohesive and part of a whole seamless story. But obviously that's a technical flourish. Were you at this point sort of simultaneously doing storyboards? I don't know, sticky notes. Were you doing an analog mapping out of the sequence offline as well as the sort of digital solution online?
Yeah, the structure of the piece went through a lot of different iterations. I think ideally it could have had like a transition from those like two blocks side by sides into the larger chart, but I think for me, technically, I didn't know if I could accomplish that, and I didn't know if it was, I guess, worth the time investment to investigate that, or whether the story and the narrative were coming across. I think one of the things that was important to me was to have that block be really clear about what it represented in the methodology, so that when you got to where I've displayed all the data, the blocks still made sense in that context.
Yes.
Because I was worried that it wouldn't make sense. Like, what do these blocks mean? What do they mean when the height changes and the background disappears? And at first, I couldn't figure out how to do that transition from where the blocks are individually on the page and then they merge together into the larger block. And when I asked people about what do you think, does this make sense, they're kind of giving me like, not quite. So that was kind of the push to get that transition right.
Now you mentioned there's some other people. So who are these people? Who are the testers that you were running this past?
Just anyone that was willing, friends, family,
Get them to check it, and it's usually the best people to rely upon for that sort of initial sense of, is this making sense, and does it work as a piece of analysis and story? Now, I mean, the stat bar chart that we effectively end up with at this point is the most obvious way to show this, but were you considering any other chart types at this point, or was it just so screechingly obvious that because it's going to preserve that portrait rectangle of the cover, that the part of the whole would be better like that than pie chart or some other method?
Yeah. One of the things I wanted to accomplish with the storytelling was like chart transitions. So the first chart I knew I wanted was like the barcode scatterplot type thing, and then from there I was kind of working
Oh, okay,
backwards.
right.
And I thought the more like scatterplot type thing was good at looking at kind of the overall trend, but it was harder to see sort of the individual covers. So I thought having kind of the like grid layout of all the
Yeah.
months and years would be nice to look at them that way. And I still think you get the trend of like on the left hand side, the text coverage is higher, so the blocks are a lot taller. And as you move towards kind of the right hand side, which is more recent years, the text coverage decreases, the blocks are a bit smaller. But yeah, I thought both representations were interesting to look at and
Yeah.
made a quite interesting transition between them.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. And usually there is something to be seen about the same analysis from two different windows, two different viewpoints. I think that
Yeah.
absolutely perfectly captures that. But before we get to that, we do have in the sequence of the journey through the project a bit of text, a bit of commentary,
Mhm.
a bit of history that sort of gives a bit of context to why the covers may have evolved. And I thought there's some really interesting things that I'd never thought about before. And I'll just sort of tee you up to speak more about it. But the idea that at one point in history, the magazines didn't have to sell themselves on the magazine itself
Mm.
until they became sold largely through newsstands where you got to grab attention and give people a sense of the prospect of what's in this issue. But yeah, just sort of tell us a bit more about that stuff because it's interesting, as you said, as a byproduct of this, it's the interesting sort of social history as much as anything.
Yeah, I think definitely what was happening economically and maybe more recently technologically had a huge impact on the amount of cover, on the amount of text that was on the cover. So kind of when Vogue first began in kind of the 1890s, the early 1900s, probably all the way up until the 50s or so, it was all kind of like a subscription base and it wasn't as heavily reliant on kind of newsstand sales.
Mm,
So they didn't have as much of this text kind of advertising what was in the pages. But as kind of the economic model shifted towards more of like advertising type thing, they did need to leverage sort of these tabloidy kind of clickbait.
mm.
That's the appropriate term for print, but
I know what you mean.
yeah, cover lines
Eyeball
so that
bait,
people would,
yeah.
yeah, so that people would want to kind of buy the magazines. But I think that was kind of the trend that kind of persisted until more recently, where this technological boom where everyone has kind of a mobile device or has
Mm,
a laptop or something, where the first time they are seeing the magazine might not necessarily be on a newsstand, but might be kind of on social media
yeah,
somewhere.
sure.
And those cover lines, the small text, don't translate quite as well onto small screen sizes. So how should Vogue kind of shift to still capture people's attention? And I think their solution was to kind of go for more editorial, high fashion photography, and have more focus on kind of the cover model themselves, and provide that kind of access to celebrity. Um, yeah.
And in terms of the sequencing of the content that we see,
Mm.
did you think it was important to almost interrupt the flow of these charts that you've sort of set us up with the Rihanna case study?
Yeah.
And before we get into the big grid of all the month by month and year by year sort of small multiples, you've offered us this context. Did you think actually, yeah, let's just sort of take a pause before we get too data led
Yeah.
or data intensive? Did you feel a need to sort of interject with a story at that point, in a sense?
Yeah, one thing I did try was to have it just set up kind of chronologically, where I first introduced that kind of backstory, and then get into kind of the two Rihanna covers,
Right.
and then get into kind of the larger charts with all the data, but I think for me it felt like there wasn't a hook or anything to like get you
Right.
kind of interested in it. And I did take one course when I was getting my undergraduate degree on visual journalism, and I forget the exact word for it, but kind of that first paragraph or so is so important for getting readers interested in the story. And so I thought,
Is it the lead?
yeah, that's it,
Yeah,
yeah.
LEDE, the lead. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, thank you for that. I thought kind of the methodology visualization was almost a part of that.
Yeah.
But I didn't want to just ignore kind of everything that I didn't analyze, because that still felt important in giving the reader context about even like where I first started collecting data in the 2000s, what had happened before that,
Mm.
and kind of setting up Anna Wintour's influence on the
Absolutely
magazine.
right.
So yeah, that was kind of the structure I landed on.
No, and it, just from my very first reading of the project, it made a lot of sense to not just throw the data at me at that point. To give me a bit of backstory, and as you said, to sort of almost lead us up to January 2000. Trying to learn how to say dates properly. January 2000, and then you can launch into this sort of small multiples grid where we've got the full set of these, essentially the little stat bar charts with the amount of text coverage per issue, and even on that view alone, you can start to see this evident pattern. But it's not until we flick through a few more little kind of captions, and before we move on, there's a nice moment when you decide to kind of remove the 100%ness of the bars and just show the stacks on a kind of consistent scale, in a sense to illuminate even further the extent to which these numbers are varied. Did you feel that was a necessary, almost staging post to go from the stat bar to this kind of barcode strip plot? Did you feel that there was a need for that in between state to sort of do that transition as smoothly as possible?
Yeah, I think going from the stack bar chart, where you have kind of the text coverage in relation to the tire coverage versus just to the text coverage, again, I wanted to have that link between where I've discussed the methodology, kind of that final visualization, and then the first chart and the second visualization, where it has all the data. But I didn't think that the trend was as obvious when kind of it was almost like smushed the text coverage.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
And so I thought kind of getting rid of kind of the stack bar chart and just focusing on the text coverage, it made it a little bit more visually obvious. I think it's just kind of like the color contrast and the relative heights were a bit more obvious.
The spatial room just lets it breathe a bit more, I think, as a data point. Yeah, and I think another comment about the style of these charts is that they're very, again, it's kind of in line with the whole overall tone of the project, but they're very light of the classic chart apparatus of grid lines and tick marks and axis lines. And again, was that a conscious choice? And labels, they're just bars. You can get the labels if you want, interactively speaking. But did you feel that from a stylistic point of view, you wanted to keep them quite, just quite blocky, quite colors, not too much like Excel default charts?
Yeah, definitely. That is was something that was crossing my mind. I was almost thinking about like if Vogue was to have a data visualization or chart, how would they go about styling it? And I think for me,
That's
one of the
nice.
things
That's
is
a nice way to frame it, actually. Yeah, I
yeah,
like that.
yeah, keeping it quite like sleek.
Yeah.
And I don't know, chic. But also like the colors, having more of like a feminine color as the accent. So yeah, I think that was one of the reasons why it's relatively minimal. And then maybe in the back of my mind, I guess one of the first things I learned with like data visualization was like the data to ink ratio.
Right, yes.
From Edward Tufte. So I'm always quite cautious about, do I really need this axis line or do I need this label? But yeah.
Especially when the patterns are so evident, it doesn't it doesn't feel the need to be able to read off an exact data point as such. But obviously with that, you've also got the backup of the, in a sense, the first interactive action that we are invited to do, which is to hover over the blocks, and we get there the month, the year, the text coverage percentage, and then a little thumbnail of your annotated blocked front covers. So again, were you thinking at that point it was necessary / nice to give people not just a data value, but to see that in context?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I thought about was kind of up to that point, it was very explanatory almost, in terms of I've been kind of telling the reader what to get out of it, what the trend is, and I thought it was nice to have a place where the reader could kind of explore that for themselves. And if they had a specific issue in mind, they could go straight to it or investigate kind of that outlier that I mentioned earlier, like that kind of investigation. I thought would be nice for the audience to explore.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I did, and I took that invitation, but then we switch from what's now at this point the bar charts to I mean, there's different names for these charts: strip plots, barcode charts, dot plots, and it's now the x-axis is the year, we've got the y-axis is the text coverage, and we've got a little marker for every issue. Actually, before I get into this, I need to go back to one thing which I emailed you about before we got into the conversation about this slightly annoying nature of their issues, where June, July, the summer issues of 2020, 2021, 2022, they don't have a separate July issue. And I found that annoying, almost on your behalf, thinking I've got this really nice, neat 12 months, 22 years. Oh, what's happening to those months? So we had a chat about this on email, but just kind of, again, for the viewers and listeners, just tell us about those slightly annoying anomalies in those particular years.
Yeah, so recently, Vogue has shifted to 11 covers in kind of 2021, 2022, and then they shifted again to 10 issues in 2023, where they kind of just combined 2 months together to form a summer issue or a winter issue. And they've been a little bit mysterious about why that is, but other kind of magazines have done the same, and I think kind of the speculation about that is just as things are moving towards a more digital medium, it doesn't make sense for them financially to just push out 12 issues a year. Yeah, it was definitely a little bit annoying, especially where you have the small multiples. Visually, just a lot of negative space there that kind of.
Well, I think that's a point though, because I can imagine you had a little bit of a concern about how to make sure they're not seen as issues with zero text. They're issues that didn't exist, so it's zero issues, because that is something that's an important distinction, isn't it, between nothingness and zero.
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, the cutoff was an interesting debate in terms of, do I just kind of stop before those years, or keep it until kind of 2022? And I think one of the reasons I kept it was because I thought kind of the impact of the pandemic, and sort of like the Black Lives Matter conversations that were going on had such a dramatic impact on the text on the cover and kind of tonally what it was saying, that it was important to keep. Yeah, it is a little bit annoying.
Yeah, I felt that on your behalf then, but yes, but thank you for sharing that. Going back to the strip plot, so we've now got a sense of not just the spread of all the distribution of all the text coverage on each issue, but then we now see an average emerging year by year, and it's very clear that there's a trend forming, and it's then a nice jumping point back to some commentary, back to some history, back to some more specific analyses of what I think comes down to 3 specific eras, correct me if I'm wrong, where you've got kind of notable trends. You've got this sort of bump up to the peak, and then you've got the first kind of drop down the hill, and then we've kind of got the more recent, probably quite, I'd actually more stark decline thereafter. And what I loved about this stage in the scrollytelling experience is that we've got this little inset line chart which just acts as a little orientation device. Here's the period that we're looking at, not just in terms of the years, but in terms of the trend story. Just on that, when did you, I don't know, arrive at the idea for that little inset chart? So I think it's such a clever device to, again, kind of keep us aware of where we are at this point in the content.
Yeah, it was kind of a last minute addition, if I'm honest. Originally, what happened was you got to that kind of strip plot, barcode plot, and then kind of the written piece that now follows it, it would kind of appear as sort of like the scrolly telling text
Right,
that kind of
yeah.
goes up it. And then parts of the chart would be highlighted just by using like a rectangle or something. But as I was working on it, I found it hard to fit all that story and all that writing into like little bite-sized pieces of information.
And it's a busy chart behind it as well, so there's a
Yeah.
lot going on. Yeah,
and as someone who was like interested in the subject, I found it a little bit boring just to like sit through and scroll through all this stuff. And also I wanted to have the magazines like shown in with like kind of embedded within the text, and it was a little bit tricky to show that information and have that consistency with the other bits of writing within that small little scrolly telling bit. So I decided to just show the barcode plot and then get into the story, but I still wanted to have that connection to that larger chart.
Yeah.
One of the things, we're working on a project at work actually, where we were looking at, there's a thing in Observable called the Minimap. I don't know if you've seen it, but this idea of like having like a visualization not be the main focus point, but something to help the reader or the user who's using a product just kind of orient themselves within the piece and have that additional context. So I guess all the stars aligned for me,
right.
so that I had that idea, and yeah, I think it worked pretty well.
It did. I think it's a terrific device, and it takes us through this commentary to supplement the data analysis that we've seen, and towards the kind of the final step of the journey, which is again back over to the reader, the viewer, to say, right, you've heard from me, have a little play around, and what we can do now is explore the magazines, we can sort them, we can just see the covers again, having gone from cover to data to chart to written, we're now back to covers. And again, I think it's a very logical and I think a very sensible place to finish the story, aside from what follows, which is the method and the footnotes and all the kind of attribution. But I think that's a nice idea. And again, just what thinking led you to decide that's where we'll finish?
Yeah, I guess one aspect of it was just I had never done anything like that before, where you have to sort it and then do like the math to determine like how many covers are on there, how many are left. So I think that was one challenge I wanted to like take on. And the other thing, I thought it would just be useful from the reader's point of view to be able to have that sorting capability, because there's not one area in the piece where you could identify, okay, these are the covers with the most text. So I thought it would be interesting for the reader to be able to kind of get that information for themselves, or go through it kind of chronologically if that's how they wanted to tackle it. So yeah, just I guess balancing that exploratory versus explanatory.
Of course, yeah.
Thing again.
Which is a perfect blend and a very catchy name for a potential podcast series, if you don't mind me saying. So that's the kind of journey through the project. Before we just kind of look at some final reflections, are there any other little details that I've not asked you about that you think I need to tell people about this, or any other choices, or have we covered most of them?
I think that was everything. Yeah, it was fun to talk about. I feel like most people don't ask me these nitty-gritty questions. So yeah.
Well,
so nice.
that's the curse of studying this subject, I guess. The little details make such a big difference, and you've totally demonstrated them across this piece. But I guess the final step then is your own reflections about this process. You said it was a passion project, and it helps therefore if it's enjoyable, and if it's something that you've set out to try and learn new techniques. Did you enjoy it, and did you feel that you benefit from the experience in learning the techniques that you did?
Definitely, like technically, I feel my skills have improved. As I think I mentioned, I only had a limited experience with SvelteKit, and I hadn't used it before in like a personal project, and I never used a front-end framework either. So it was a big learning experience in that way. And yeah, now I love SvelteKit. I think every project from here on out, I do SvelteKit. And also in terms of, it was quite a big challenge in terms of structuring the story and thinking about how the data can support it and help tell that narrative. And I never done kind of this narrative-driven type thing before. So that was really fun to kind of explore and get my first kind of dip my toes on the water. And in terms of how I perceive it now, I guess one thing I've always struggled with any type of art, whether it just be sort of more traditional graphic design or photography, is like, does how I feel about it change after I hear like other people's opinion on it, if that makes sense, and trying to separate my own feelings from external validation.
Yeah.
But I think in terms of like, do I have opinions about it, or I could have done the styling a bit differently, or kind of structured it or worded it different. There's little bits and pieces where I could feel like I could tease it forever. But I think on the whole, I'm quite happy with it. I can appreciate.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that, I mean, doing things different doesn't always mean that different is better.
Yeah.
As you said, for a subject that doesn't have a single path to the right answer, you can endlessly tweak these things, and it just becomes a different project, maybe worse, through those changes. But I mean, the external validation that we opened with was the pudding cup. But in terms of other feedback, what's the little, I don't know, the little nugget of response or a tweet or a comment? What's been the favorite bit of feedback that you've received other than the trophy, which is quite a big one?
I mean, there's been loads. I mean, even doing this and having kind of that validation of feeling respected by the DataViz community has been really nice. And I think one thing I thought was nice was someone like on LinkedIn messaged to ask like how I did this, because they wanted to learn as well. And
oh, cool.
That was wild to me, because I feel like I'm still in that position where I feel in awe of some of the data visualizations I see and not understanding how they did it, and wouldn't even know how to start. So kind of being on the opposite end of that was a little bit surreal.
Absolutely, but totally deserves, because it's a wonderful project, and it's been fascinating to hear the story behind it. So thank you so much, Jess, for your time today. Really interesting, really great story. And I wish you all the best in whatever projects you move on to next, whether it's in the workplace that we can't see, or more publicly in other projects like this. But thank you for your time. It's been lovely to see you. And thank you to all the viewers and listeners out there for spending time with us. And see you soon on another episode of Explore, Explain. Bye for now.
Bye.
To see more information about today's episode, including some links to key sites and resources mentioned, please visit my website at visualizingdata.com. Here you'll also be able to find details about my book, information about my public and private training courses, as well as over a decade of blog posts. If you've enjoyed this series, please consider liking, subscribing and spreading the word. See you next time.